Hello, my name is David Hunt. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Corporate Services and Innovation with the Province of Manitoba, Department of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm pleased to be serving as the moderator at the 2022 Manitoba Protein Summit for this panel discussion, which is titled Indigenous-led Protein Innovation and Perspective. The discussion will look at how to increase the engagement and collaboration among Indigenous communities and stakeholders in the protein sector, which I believe is a discussion that is both urgent and overdue, as well as critical to our combined success. I should note that this session is being pre-recorded, but we do invite the attendees to post questions in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll invite the panelists to respond through the live chat as well. So to begin, I'm pleased to introduce our four panelists who have the experience and knowledge to provide informed perspectives on this topic. So to begin, I'll call on each panelist and ask them to introduce themselves before moving on to the discussion. And to begin, I'd like to introduce Bruce Hardy. Bruce?
Hi, my name is Bruce Hardy. I've been in Manitoba for most of my life, born in Calgary, but grew up in Brandon, Manitoba. I've run a software company focused on Indigenous health for about 20 years and started to see the real connection between moving away from traditional diets to more Western processed diets is having a huge impact on diabetes and other chronic disease conditions. And so I started looking at what could be the food interventions. And by working with traditional elders and healers, really looked at both sustainable fish-based proteins, as well as using that fish to grow things like wild rice. And wild rice from an Indigenous perspective is #1 of the top 10 plant-based proteins. So that's really looking at the future of food as medicine and the future of medicine as food type of idea.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Next, I'd like to ask Alfred Lee to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm the president and owner of Native Canadian Chip Corporation. I produce potato chips and branching out into other products such as coffee, as well as into lettuce, berries, and so forth. And to look at healthy foods. At the beginning, healthy foods don't pay the bills. So I had to look at the convenience side of the business to get enough money to put into research and development, as we don't, as Indigenous people, have access to capital. And in this case, I've had to get the capital from selling of my product and then investigate into healthy products and that. So that's what we're doing in terms of aquaponics.
Great, thank you. I'd like now to turn to Richard Tuck to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Richard Tuck. I'm CEO of Wakapa Financial, and Wakapa Financial is actually one of the co-founders of the Social Entrepreneurship Enclave. And that enclave helps marginalized entrepreneurs, so Indigenous, LGBTQ2, BIPOC, youth, women, etc., overcome the barriers of entrepreneurship, overcome those extra barriers to entrepreneurship because of who they are.
Great, thank you, Richard. And now Michael Mikulak.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Michael Mikulak. I am the Executive Director of Food and Beverage Manitoba. We are an industry association that promotes the development of a thriving food and beverage processing industry in Manitoba to ensure that our members have the resources, strength, and conditions favorable to their success. A lot of people don't know that food and beverage manufacturing is actually the largest manufacturing industry in Manitoba and generally across the country. And our mandate is really to support those businesses in terms of what they need. So we do a lot of work around training, mentorship, providing information, market intelligence, networking and connections, and sort of events in order to help our members thrive.
Great, thank you, Michael. And again, thank all four of you for your participation today. So to start the discussion, maybe what I'll do, I'll ask the first question and I'll open it up for anyone to respond. So the first question, what steps can we take to increase industry, government, and academia's understanding of the Indigenous perspective around the key principles of the sustainable protein strategy? Any thoughts, comments? Just jump in.
Is there anything between the lines there?
Perhaps. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes.
Go ahead, Alfred.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm looking at the questions. Some of the questions are redundant. And from my standpoint, either I don't understand the question. Some of the questions are fairly long for me. And, you know, one of the things for me as a business person is I need to have my products into the marketplace. And it's a very costly thing for any Indigenous, I mean, outside of myself, I mean, I've gotten product into, you know, pretty well all the major stores in Canada and down in the US. We're starting in California. I started there before COVID, but we don't seem to have in Canada any, you know, capital or trade shows. You know, we need trained labor force, and that's a big thing for me.
I guess I know that some of the audience members they're struggling with the idea of Indigenous reconciliation. And so a lot of times what I describe is there's two different things. If there's Indigenous inclusion, that's a very different view, because what you're looking at is how do we get Indigenous people as a diversity into established, you know, government departments or in businesses. How do you attract that? And that has all sorts of merit, because now you have an Indigenous employee or a partner that looks at the world a little bit differently. Now, the second question, and it's a very different one, is how do we treat Indigenous ways of doing things? So right now, there isn't a lot of acceptance in the capital side, in the funding side from Ag Canada, or, you know, different programs out there for an Indigenous approach to food production. So if you look at an Indigenous way in which we do healthcare, or Indigenous, our society has yet to have, how do we take those ways in which we approach and we see healthcare, because we don't see the difference between food as medicine and medicine as food. And when we go into a non-Indigenous system, you say, well, wait, the moment that we start talking about this is medicine, that's a different agency, a different funding pot. Now, because a lot of Indigenous communities are very far away from shipping, then you can't have a commodity play. And so the only real opportunity for Indigenous businesses is to really play to our strengths, which is we're looking at foods that have functional food, or, you know, medicinal or nutraceutical, to use Western terms, but really medicine perspectives. So sometimes we get caught in these things where we really need to think about how do we include Indigenous ways of food production as a part of overall health, a holistic approach to overall health and wellness as a part of Canadian society. And that's going to help us rethink, are we bringing in an Indigenous person, inclusion, or are we open to accepting a different way of our relationship with our food? And those are two different questions.
Yeah, no, that's excellent points. Both you and Alfred, you touched on a bit the lack of, I'll say, programming specific to Indigenous entrepreneurs. Richard, did you want to comment on that at all, or?
On the programming perspective, yeah. Well, actually, I'll go back. I like what Bruce was saying, and I think from that inclusion perspective, I think one of the downfalls of the TRC is that, you know, it kind of looked at Indigenous inclusion to industry, you know, call number 92, as you could just have an entry level position and, you know, you'll check a box. And I think what we're talking about is actually putting Indigenous people into decision making and governance positions in these organizations, so that when you go and do, you know, joint ventures, or you're working with Indigenous communities, you have an understanding, or a better understanding at least, on how to meet on their terms using their protocols on their lands and be respectful and genuine and authentic in that process. So I think that I wanted to reinforce that.
Yeah, and if I could chime in, like I think I come from a community development background, and I think when we work in this sort of economic development space, we often come in with a sort of our ideas of what that looks like, our metrics, our ways of measuring success in these things, and those often don't line up. And I think it's really not rocket science. If you're going to come into a community, no matter what that community is, focus on building relationships and trust and on co-creation. Like you need to sort of respect whatever that community is. You need to really respect their needs and understand. So if there is a shipping issue and it's not a commodity play and you're more about food sovereignty and food security or food as medicine, it's a different outcomes and need different programming and different support systems. You can't really go in with that kind of one size fits all approach. And I think starting with that kind of authentic engagement with a willingness to sort of change your programming, your response. That's the key to really any kind of authentic engagement with any community, but especially with communities that have a historic experience of violence, marginalization, all of these things. Like you really need to start with that kind of engagement and willingness to shift.
There's also a big difference between the First Nations and the Métis. I'm First Nations, but I grew up off reserve in a Métis community in Pine Dog, and we're fishers. And the only thing we knew to do is to work, and we had nowhere else to rely on any income from anywhere else. The treaties with the First Nations, well, they do have funding for the community, whether it's welfare or economic development. We never, as Métis, never had that. The only thing we had is the work ethic. So but both today, from a financial standpoint, is now both have the Métis are more involved, but they both function as a government, and then they don't look at us as entrepreneurs when they're doing development. Their development is primarily from a government standpoint, whether it's the band government or a Métis government or a provincial government, federal government. It doesn't look at the individual and doesn't support the individual. They're only starting to look at it now because most entrepreneurs do it on their own.
So David, I'll just jump in here because I think that this discussion here is awesome, because a lot of people that are maybe watching this are thinking and have a lot of questions that they're scared to ask, right? So we're gonna go there. So just to put context on that, in Canada legally, and this is to speak to the Métis, it was under the leadership of Chartrand. They won that court case, not only for Métis, but for all of Canadians to understand, is that it's actually illegal to discriminate between Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. Now, those are very distinct groups. Now, because of the history of the relationship between First Nations, which the First Nations are sovereign nations, which report to the Governor General, if you will, and so does the Prime Minister. Those are actually, it's almost like a dual state in Canada. But Métis and Inuit never had that kind of seat at the table. So that paints a lot of programming, why it's kind of what perceives as bent towards First Nations and give these things. Now, just to, the comment about Métis had to work, I think both I've been blessed to be in many Métis Inuit communities and First Nations communities, but just to highlight an example is that when we're talking about reconciliation between a Western system and, say, a health system and a food system and Indigenous, is that a good colleague of mine, he's a healer. He actually works in 3 hospitals in Toronto, side by side with Western doctors. You go in, get your blood work done, but the difference is that he's not recognized by the healthcare system. So when you go and see a white doctor or a non-Indigenous doctor, he gets a fee at a doctor level. So that's an equitable exchange for his services to see you. He writes you a subscription, he gets another fee. And then the pharmaceutical company gets royalties from selling you the metformin or whatever it is. The Indigenous healer sees you for free on his time. He has to prescribe to you the medicine, and on which he has picked himself. So that's where you can start seeing the inequality. So, you know, these First Nations or Métis healers are putting all this effort in, but because there's this not recognition that it has the same value and services, this healer that I have, he used to fix boilers so that he could practice his medicine. And so that's where there's a lot of kind of, I think, misunderstanding between Western and non, is that, yes, there's a lot of resources from a perception going to support Indigenous communities, but it has more to do with an equity in the system for similar services. Now, keep in mind that the aspirin comes from the bark of willow tree, that active ingredient. 80% of pharmaceuticals out there are derived from Indigenous knowledge and or products and services. So you wouldn't have that disparity in conversations like this if we had an approach to recognizing equal pay, equal effort.
So thanks for that, Bruce. Like, you talk about I'll say the systemic type challenges, which are obvious, which are present. I'm just wondering, like, when we talk about protein in the protein sector, like, are there other specific challenges facing the Indigenous communities, or does the systemic issues override anything else that could be a bit of a barrier for that type of innovation and development? And I open it up to anyone.
So I'll chime in. So C last year did a study. Well, we did a couple of studies, but one of them looked at the entrepreneurial ecosystem for Indigenous people in Manitoba, and the other one was the barriers to food entrepreneurship by Indigenous entrepreneurs and communities. And yeah, so systemic, lots there, but you know, there's also this, as Bruce was alluding to in his kind of introduction. What we heard over and over was from the Indigenous communities was that there is this, that Indigenous people have lost the connection to food, right? And, you know, every single community that we talked about having programs or wanting money or wanting to do something around food security, food sovereignty, and food-related health diseases. Right. And so that connection, because that connection to food was lost, we have to do something to reconnect that. And so suggestions that came from communities were, you know, community gardens and kitchens, like community kitchens that were, you know, commercial kitchens by kind of standards, but they were culturally appropriate and they had training. Things like that allow that reconnection to happen, because without reconnecting to food, you know, how can you be involved or innovate around food or be wanting to work in the industry at all, right? And so we kind of have to start there. Alfred talked about funding. That was number 2. You know, after reconnecting to food, number 2 was funding. There's human resources, which he also alluded to, technical or technology in general, and then technical know-how, and then regulation. So those were kind of the big 5 of our study from the Indigenous entrepreneurs.
Michael, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alfred put it really well. Starting a food business is hard, like, for anybody. And it's even harder if you live in a remote community without infrastructure, like abattoirs, for example. I mean, this is something we hear from our members all the time. Access to abattoirs is a major problem, even in densely populated urban areas, right? I work with farmers who are trying to sort of get you know, their animals in, and they have too few, so they can't work with their. Imagine how difficult that is in a northern community, right, where you're trying to do that. And then again, if you think about those sort of metrics of success, right, food is extremely expensive in a lot of these communities, right? And so if you're talking about this sort of economic export sort of development type model that a lot of food businesses seem to follow, which is like, I want to export this food, or I want to get into stores or whatever, that model doesn't necessarily gel with the needs of that community. Like maybe the success in that community looks like we can produce more of our own food, or we can grow more of our own food through the year and create sort of more micro enterprises. So you have to be able to work with those communities and realign those goals and opportunities, because starting a food business is extremely difficult. And I think this is one of those circumstances where this idea of like universal design, where you try to make things as accessible as possible, building together sort of all these different ones and acknowledging the sort of specificity of basically reducing barriers, making these things accessible, is so important, because it's going to benefit all those entrepreneurs in there. But it is hard. It is so hard starting a business, a food business. There's a lot of regulation involved.
And that's part of how I see government helping, is reducing those barriers, right? BC just allowed for small scale abattoirs and kind of anywhere, right? Like, so how does Manitoba do something similar that again looks at, so we're working with Broken Head, and what they want to do. So they want to do community gardens, they want to do a commercial kitchen, and they also want to raise bison, right? And so, okay, so how do you put a local, slaughterhouse and do that process, but do it on a micro scale, on a smaller scale, where still it allows entry into the food supply system? That's a barrier that needs to be resolved, right? Like that's a big barrier.
And the other thing about Indigenous product, like I've always had the question, when the products on the store shelf, the big question is always, how much of our tax dollar is in this company? Here's another Indigenous company getting money from government again. Why should I buy it? And that's been a huge issue on my part. And each time I go to a store, I have to show up in the stores and show my face that I am an Indigenous person, and that there is no government funding it. And that's the sad part. I mean, I don't know how you're going to overcome that.
The comment that I think is important here is that we need to, one of the suggestions that I've often put back is that I think we need to set targets. And if you say as a government that we need to find and mentor and set a target, so how many Indigenous businesses that have a goal of 10 million in revenue and above, because a business that's 10 million in revenue above is a very different structure, a governance structure, all that stuff. And when you raise capital for it, it's all different. And then between say 2.5 million and 10 million, maybe we have a goal of 50 businesses, and then under 2.5 million and 500,000 and above, that's where all the programming is. There is literally no Indigenous business programming for above 500,000, and it's create this artificial idea or perception in the industry, and that includes Farm Credit Canada, BED, all these entities, that businesses above that Indigenous can't do with it for perception reasons. So I think starting out with metrics is really important, because we need to be held accountable to say, how do we then allocate one or two people that can, work with businesses above? And there's two different ways, strategies of going. So we've heard, say, from Broken Head doing the micro avatars approach. The second way is kind of more like a Tesla way, where the very first electric car was a fancy one that no one could afford. And in terms of ethical luxury items, I think that's an idea that we can go after, and that's what we're trying to do. So when I work with people like the Federated Co-op, who are very interested, like, oh, Bruce, we'll buy your wild rice and you'll buy your fish, but we'll put gold on it. And I said, well, that's great, but what would you think if there was an Indigenous aisle? And they said, well, what would you put in it? And I said, how about rice? Well, that makes no sense, Bruce. That's just one bag on an entire aisle. And I said, no. Think about it like wine, because I'm going to have to deal with the fact that Métis have lost their strains of wild rice. So I'm going to need to work with my cousins, my First Nations brothers and sisters, partners, to say, we'll help you redevelop these strains, establish a strain bank. But when we do, we're going to find out that the wild rice, say from Broken Head or wherever, has a nutty flavor. So we're going to dark roast it so it pairs well with a bison or a steak. And then the wild rice that we grow from, a different area, we lightly roast it so it pairs well with a fish or a pâté de foie gras or something like that. And so much like when you go and buy coffee, you can see all these Indigenous rice blends that with their pairing, and then you can get that premium. And then the second thing we need to do is have the consumers understand that link between, much like the kosher product, that it follows the indigenous protocols and it's authentic, and using things like blockchain to do that. So that's kind of my final point. But with getting into the fish industry, just to give you an example, 860 metric tons to 1,000 metric tons of fish is 1 semi a week. And that's around 10 million in revenue. But that's the smallest you can be, because you imagine knocking on the door of Sobeys or Loblaws or Costco, unless you have 1 semi a week, you'll never get in. So it's complex. It's an enormously complex. But if you ask Sobeys and Loblaws, could you put a purchase order and then have Export Development Canada, secure against that, then you can talk to a bank which is non-dilutive. Because the moment that you have investors at the door and you dilute more than 51%, the game's over. You're not Indigenous anymore. And then you're reliant on government programs for help. And then it brings us back to my colleague who said, there is behavioral bias in purchasing racism in Canada. And that's just the way it is if you identify too much as Indigenous. So it's not a fun place to be, but it's part of our story. And it's no different than women's suffrage, right? There was a time when society said men and women are equal, but it's taken us 10 years to find all those different places where there's gender inequality. And the one thing that we never did is to say, let's do a pilot project with women and men to see if their brain sizes are different. We would never, it would be unacceptable. So why are we doing this pilot project to say that Indigenous businesses can be equal? Of course we can. We don't want pilot projects. We want equitable access to capital. We want equitable access to programs. And we want programs that aren't broken.
Yeah.
80% of your programs work for commodities. Don't try to indigenize them. Just if you want 2% of the funding to go to Indigenous, create a separate pot and then work with Indigenous, say, we're going to have Indigenous other businesses help to review and have all that due diligence you normally have. But don't break something that's not broken. Your programs are awesome because the hemp growers, the grain growers, they've mastered it. Don't make them Indigenous because there's only 1 or 2 applications. So how hard is it just to create a separate pot, have the due diligence so society knows that no one wants a free ride. We want the opportunity to work our butts off, to be proud and to be a part of an inclusive society.
So I'm just gonna add one. You said so much, and then Bruce, I think you need to cut down just a little bit because there's about 6 points I also wanted to talk about. But I think again, I want to make sure that the audience knows that when we talk about programming, and again, I look at it more from a holistic Indigenous, not necessarily food, and definitely not necessarily within food protein. Although we are building that out here in Manitoba, that from the entrepreneur's perspective, and even my perspective of what I see, is there's this what I call a misalignment, right? And so what I and what C really strongly believes is that because of kind of the systemic issues that have marginalized these communities, that those entrepreneurs should have access to kind of the best mentors and the best programming. As just to not waste their time. And unfortunately, government believes that Indigenous peoples should just be happy with whatever they get. And so often we're kind of seated at the kiddie table with recent business grads with no experience, no real ability to scale and grow, or others who've had like no success in their own startups, but with bureaucratic or governmental connections. And so until that misalignment happens or ends, all we're doing is further marginalizing the communities, we're further entrenching those systems, and we're failing Indigenous entrepreneurs. And that's why, again, we are putting money into the food system because Indigenous entrepreneurs and Indigenous communities have said the food system is really important to us, right? And so it's the government. I totally agree with Bruce. The government, if you want to do, 2% of targeted for Indigenous entrepreneurship, well, go and talk to those in communities, figure out what they're doing, and then fund that. Not try and fit them into your model, but talk to them, figure what they're doing, and then and help them in that way. Meet them where they're at.
So for me, I need to find out who and where our Indigenous businesses are. When I try to find businesses to work with, I find that some have been funded, but they don't last too long because they haven't got the capital to go beyond their communities. It costs a lot of money, and moreover, it's time that you have to put in. I mean, for me, it's like 16 hours a day, go, and that's it, hard work. I mean, you can't, how can you replace that with money? The only thing that I need is I need more trade shows. I need to get my product out to the mainstream. And then from there, I can pull in, our First Nations or in Métis or Inuit brothers to create me products to put under my label, to create a brand. And that's the first thing you do, is go out there and create a brand, and then you follow through. There's no other way I can see that.
Sure. So lots of opportunities or areas to address, definitely. Going back to something Richard mentioned previously about how there's been that loss of the connection to food. Just wondering how does that get addressed?
Well, I think that I've had a botanist come over from Indonesia through Wardrop Engineering, and she wanted to meet the Indigenous population because she said, you have all the medicines and we have to learn from that. And she was Indonesian Chinese. And they know that our people, have the medicines. They're here. We just have to find them and find ourselves again. I guess that's it, especially me.
Yeah, and I
Just,
think
sorry about that, but just a flag on that, and this is it's tough because a lot of the programs for innovation end up having you go to a university. And so if you look at the way that a university is set up in their agreements, there's a notion of background IP and foreground IP. And if you look at the fine print in most of those agreements, is at the moment that, say, a student or a master's student or a PhD or a professor hears some of those things from an elder and then puts them into a document that now is foreground IP owned by the professor in the university. So if you actually look under the hood, and so working with Queen's University, I worked with their legal team for quite some time to introduce the concept of Indigenous knowledge. Put the Indigenous knowledge, the ITU, and use that as a placeholder to say, if your student or your professors interact with the healer that I work with or any of the Indigenous groups, they do not have the right to have derivative works or to take it or to use it for any other reason. The other thing that's interesting is they also have to understand how protocols work. And so there was a lot of pushback. And then, well, Bruce, you don't understand, like this PhD student, she's really passionate and she wants to present at this, Congress. And I said, that's not the issue, is that knowledge was to a knowledge keeper passed down for thousands of years with protocols. And what the knowledge keeper is asking is to say, they should have the ability to say, if you share this, let me know, because then I'll take it into ceremony. So when you present, you're presenting with not only yourself, but with my voice and the voice of my people. That's respect. And so a lot of time we see these things and we're just so, it's just another box to check off from a Western perspective, but not understanding the implications can impact generations of knowledge. Yeah. And that's part of the UN drip and the call to action is reconciliation, is understanding the implications of what you're doing and in the subtleties.
And I love what you're saying there, because I think what you're also sort of, getting to is that, we have this sort of Western system based on certain kinds of laws and commodities and programs and structures. And we need to sort of learn from some of these other traditions and begin to incorporate those into here. And I think to back to what Richard said, I think a lot of people are like, the food system is broken, right? We're sort of disconnected from food in a lot of ways, right? Practical level, how many, less than 2% of the population farms or participates in any primary agricultural production. That used to be a primary means for connecting us with those. And it's simple, but it's that sort of disconnection and finding ways to incorporate that back in, and then enshrining that in some of these legal sort of processes to make sure that we have that kind of that, I guess, that back and forth, or these room for these things, so that we can, like you said, honor some of these other ways of knowing and sort of processes in there. So it's not just this kind of, theft from these systems.
Going back to, oh, go ahead, Alfred.
Yeah, Bruce, I was just wondering, like in the US, I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies own the medicinal plants, the rights to it, but they do allow the First Nations to pick it and use it for their own use, but no commercial.
Oh, nice of them. Sorry. I apologize.
Going back to what David was kind of asking, I think, again, from the studies that we did and the communities that we talked to, if you're going to fund community kitchens, fund things like that, where youth can go, where women can go, and again kind of reconnect. But really, I think if we're talking to this audience, I think that unfortunately there's this government likes blingy things that they can point to and go, hey, we did this, and usually blingy things are a little bit bigger. And I think that you have to step away from that, and go, okay, it's not about, I can point to this big, processing plant, or I can point to something really big. It's to get back to the reconnection. It's to take a longer term approach. Look at what you need. Again, if I say, if we had started with community gardens and kitchens 5 years ago, we'd be having a very different conversation here, because we wouldn't have to ask that question around how do we reconnect, how do we get people interested in innovation around food, how do we get them from that interest in innovation around food, how do we get that into a product or service, and how do we get that product then into a business, and that can again scale and grow if that's the desire, right? So we're so focused on the big, where I think what we have to do is go back and start with kind of the small. And if we did that, that reconnection with nature and food, I think, again, if we had done that 10 years ago, we wouldn't need this conversation now, right? We would have businesses, we'd have more, companies and entrepreneurs like Alfred that are out there and doing things. But again, it's that reconnection that has to happen. And if government really wants to make a difference, start there.
Just because it's a fun, lively debate, I'll throw in the opposite. I think I honestly think very opposite. I think both opinions are important, and I'll paint the context. Is that the reality from a geopolitics perspective is that Canada and the US are moving from a consumptive society into a retirement home. And so we're going to really have a lot of pressure on having stimulating our economy, to be honest. And the other thing that we're having is, as these baby boomers are aging, they're on average more than 6 drugs for the average older person now. Now, if you compare kind of North America to China, you know what the difference is? One of the largest industries out there is pharmaceuticals. The next is nutraceuticals. The third is traditional Chinese medicine. So if you look at the economic leakage, as there's an aging, as they shift from a consumptive society to an aging society in China and different traditional medicines. But in Canada and the US, we're so reliant on pharmaceuticals, that's an outward migration of our dollars. So if we start having more Indigenous medicine as part of our healthcare mixture, what my hope is by getting that recognized and have the dose control, and that I'm using words that will kick me out of the egg circle. But if you have that, then you're going to stimulate more Indigenous the licensing of different methods of farming, and then the pharmaceutical dollars will, instead of going out, will go into the ag sector. And the way that Albertans kind of defend the oil patch, because they're so important to Canada's revenue, if Indigenous medicine could route inclusion and how important we are to sustaining our economy going forward. it's just a different view of it. And I think both are equal opinions. And so just challenging thoughts, that's all.
Yep, no, appreciate it. And throughout the discussion, we've touched on sort of opportunities, challenges to be faced. Often government is seen as kind of needing to have a role. I'm just wondering, like, is there a role for industry or academic institutions in addressing these barriers, these obstacles?
I know from, I want to run youth programming with, whether it's with Red River Community College or whomever, but we need to educate our youth, but we have to have them right, in the business per se. Like, say for instance, like I'm looking at greenhouses for, with the Friendship Center movement, because we have all the youth from within our communities that are from other communities, whether they're white or Indigenous, they all get along, but we come from a farming community in Riverton and Pine Dock fishing. So they have, skill sets that the Red River can use to, get these programs running. I can provide the greenhouses and so forth. So that's what I'm doing. And part of this from my side is that I have to look at aquaponics, as a way of getting our traditional foods back.
Industry is doing it, right? Like, at the end of the day, there's barriers. And if you are, passionate about what you're doing, like both Alfred and Bruce are, they're going to face barriers. Everybody faces barriers, and they're going to overcome those barriers. So industry is, by its nature, trying to overcome barriers on a daily basis. We've, C has put in close to 100,000. We haven't had any government funding. We put close to $100,000 in on just on this area alone, right? So we're seeing the barriers. Industry is doing it with or without government, right? Like, at the end of the day, government a little bit follows industry because that's the nature of the beast, and academia as well. Academia, I was at Red River, and I redeveloped their Indigenous social entrepreneurship and social innovation programs. And part of what we were talking about was, okay, how do we go into community before these students come down to Winnipeg? How do we go into community and provide advisory services or provide little courses on XYZ, and just introductory things, but so that we're building relationship and we are giving, and do it for free, and we are giving to the community, but we're really building those relationships so that when those students come, and they have less of a struggle when they get to Winnipeg, because they have people that they know. There's familiar faces they can call on. All of that kind of connection and relationship is, again, part of the reason why Indigenous education in Manitoba, across Canada, is low and faltering. Is that lack of relationship. So what does academia need to do? Go to those communities, right? Like, that's what we had planned. Unfortunately, there were some unsavory actors and systems in place, so we couldn't do that. But like, let's do that. And if you can't, partner with C. That's why, again, we're at Broken Head. Like, that's what we're doing. So you just have to get to those communities.
Yeah, and I think, when it comes down to industry, I think Manitoba has the largest gap of employment between non-Indigenous and First Nations populations, I think, of all the provinces and territories, right? So when it comes to sort of, from an industry perspective, you have to understand why. And if you're going to reach out into these communities, you really sort of need to equip yourself with understanding what those barriers are, and put it on yourself to sort of begin to make the changes internally through your policies, through your HR, through your outreach efforts, to make your workplaces a safe space, a place that people want to go to. And in general, I would say food and beverage manufacturing has a bit of a perception issue in general. Like, we are facing a pretty substantial labor shortage right now in general. A lot of plants have, 20, 25% vacancy rate. So I think there's in general a sort of a perception issue around what it is to work in the industry. And so helping change that and reaching out into these populations, into these groups, and making sure that it is that they want to work there, and that you're doing some of that work to sort of make them safe spaces that are welcoming, is so important.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And unfortunately, we're very close to the end of our time. I can't believe how quickly this went. But I'm just wondering, any final comments from anyone?
Just to wrap up on that, is it brings us full circle to the idea is that your strategy, as what you described, is that we talked about three different things. We talked about the Indigenous community and things like with what's going on in Broken Head so that community is looking at things like food security, food sovereignty. There's Indigenous businesses, which have very different challenges. How do you get into the supply chain? We've heard that today. And then there's the inclusion of Indigenous people, getting the education to go into labs in these businesses or in the communities or into government departments. So those are three different very specific targets, and you have to have different approaches and know what the implications of those strategies are.
Any other final comments? No? Okay, well, just my thanks to each of you today. The conversation has been tremendous. I'm sure the people watching have found it to be valuable. I look forward to further discussions like this because I think they're very much needed. And then turning those discussions into actions is actually what's key. So thank you all for your time today, and take care.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.